date is April 18th, 2009. At the age of 34, Anderson Silva is the UFC middleweight champion and has gone undefeated in his first 9 fights in the promotion. After making the 5th successful defense of his middleweight title against Thales Leites at UFC 97, fans were starting to turn on the Spider. Silva began his career finishing all 7 of his first 7 UFC opponents in impressive fashion, and after 2 somewhat lackluster performances against Patrick Cote and Thales Leites, some were questioning Silva's greatness. With Silva's middleweight division being completely uninteresting, Anderson would move up to 205. There, he would be booked against former champion Forrest Griffin. Although Anderson at this time was viewed largely as untouchable, Silva opened only as a -260 favorite. A former friend of Anderson and legendary fighter Vanderlei Silva openly picked Forrest to win. This was the general consensus around those picking Forrest. He was too big, too strong, too tough, and he would get to Anderson. What none of those picking the fight knew at the time is that Anderson Silva was about to have his magnum opus. The fight begins with Silva in a southpaw stance. Although southpaw was his preferred stance, Anderson was one of the first UFC champions to successfully implement dangerous striking out of both stances, a skill that is still not found in most fighters today. The first strike which lands is from Forrest, an inside low kick. You could argue these low kicks were Griffin's best weapon on the feet, as in his title victory over Quinton Rampage Jackson, the low kicks badly damaged the champion and had him unable to put any weight on his leg. After being southpaw for the first 20 seconds of the bout, Anderson switched orthodox. This immediately triggered the same low kick attack from Forrest, which he tried to set up by showing a jab. However, that didn't fool Anderson. The jab feint wasn't as convincing as it needed to be, which allowed Silva to see the low kick coming, catch it, and look to counter. Silva used this exact counter in his last bout at 205 against James Irvin, which led to the finish. Though Anderson narrowly missed this right hand, it still served a purpose, making Forrest hesitant. For the next 30 seconds, Forrest would be throwing what Joe Rogan called feelers.
He's throwing a lot of feelers out here, Mike. He's looking to gauge Anderson's response.
Strikes which are not 100% intended to land, but more to gauge the distance between opponents. Anderson was always primarily a counter striker, allowing his opponents to lead the dance and then countering where he saw his openings. Although Griffin was throwing these feelers for himself to get a better read on Anderson, it was actually having the opposite effect. This was allowing Anderson to understand the distance and the speed of Griffin's strikes very quickly. With just under 2 minutes taking place in the first round, it was time for Silva to launch his first attack. Silva begins by darting in with a long left straight out of southpaw, which brings him into an orthodox stance to throw a right straight. This sort of darting combination is common in fighters who come from karate backgrounds like Michael Page and Stephen Thompson. Silva employed these techniques in his fights as well, taking advantage of his great timing and speed. Forrest defended the attack well, and as Silva continued advancing, looked to counter with a left hook. In moments like this, Anderson's comfortability out of both stances was hugely beneficial. When Forrest falls back in a stance that isn't his traditional stance, he's uncomfortable, and he's shuffling laterally this way with his feet kind of aligned, as if he's in like a defensive stance in basketball where your feet are parallel and not like side on, like so in an orthodox stance, like say these little lines are feet, or in a southpaw stance, he's parallel. And as he's looking to exit, he's not comfortable in switching to southpaw and getting out, but you see Anderson, as he moves his head out of the way of the left hook on the counter, he's stepping back into his preferred southpaw stance. So he's orthodox here. This step covers a lot of distance, and it's cutting off Forrest where he's going to be. He's not following Forrest here. He's stepping in front of where Forrest is circling out, cutting the angle, changing the distance, and Forrest is not ready for this as he gets caught big with a right hook, which sits him down. After a couple of unsuccessful trades from both men, Silva started to egg Forrest on. This kind of taunting was very common with Silva, and partly what made him so entertaining. When Anderson started to put his hands by his side and move forward, he was at his most confident. As an opponent, when Silva's quickly moving his head in front of you with his hands by his side, it's tempting. You'd like to punch him in the face because, of course, his hands are down. It should be easy. This is what Anderson wanted. He presented a target to his opponent that wasn't really there. Silva was able to do this because of his reaction time and also the feeling out process he went through at the start of the fight. Anderson's hands are down and he's in that flow state, supremely confident with being able to read Forrest's attacks and land his own. Anderson begins by piping Forrest with a left straight. Forrest looks to counter with a jab, but Anderson slips. Anderson sees the counter which Forrest throws and gains even more confidence getting into the pocket. He starts the second exchange with the same left straight. Forrest again looks to counter with his lead hand, this time more of a hook. As I said earlier, Anderson is more of a counter puncher, but when he has already hurt his opponent, that will make them more hesitant. So to make his opponent offensive, he employs the first and third strategy. Being first is starting your attack, and then being third is letting your opponent counter, going second, and then countering their counter, being third. This is how Anderson got Forrest to open up and started to punish him. The final sequence of the fight is frankly legendary. Silva looks at Griffin with his hands directly by his side with no respect for what Griffin is offering back. Griffin throws a long right straight with his head and shoulders falling over his feet. Ideally when punching, you'd like to have your feet underneath you instead of trailing behind. With all of Griffin's weight barreling towards Anderson, all it takes for Silva to drop Griffin again is a short lead right hand. In one of the most legendary careers in MMA history, this performance at UFC 101 was truly Anderson Silva's most special.